Thanks everybody for being here. Good evening and welcome. My name is Mary Kinney. I'm a publicity chair for the Portland chapter of the Native Plant Society of Oregon. Uh, NPSO promotes the enjoyment, study, and protection of Oregon's native plants. I'd like to especially welcome any new members tonight. As part of our mission, we present a speaker each month on timely topics of interest to our members. Our speakers tonight are Kristin Currin and Drew Merritt, presenting the beauty and biodiversity, conservation and cultivation of native plants in the Columbia River Gorge. First, let's review some Zoom etiquette. Most of you are already doing this. Your audio and video should be turned off during the program. After the presentation, you'll be able to unmute and turn cameras on. This will be a perfect time for new members to introduce themselves and connect with each other virtually. If you have a question during the program, you can chat box. Our presenters will address questions after the presentation. You may notice a closed captioning feature, which you can click on and enable. Now it's time to introduce our speakers. Kristin Currin and Andrew Merritt are the authors of the Pacific Northwest Native Plant Primer, are the co-founders of Humble Roots Nursery, a native plant nursery in the Columbia River Gorge, recognized for its efforts in sustainability and promoting native plants, while ethically propagating many important species. Their work and passion for plants has involved them with innumerable native plant endeavors, including pollinator and conservation plantings of all shapes and sizes, school gardens, backyard habitats, restoration projects, and rare plant conservation. Welcome to Kristin and Drew.
Thank you so much, Mary.
Take it away.
All right, I'm gonna share screen here. How does that look for you, Mary?
Looks perfect.
All right, terrific. Let me reduce that. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you to the Native Plant Society of Oregon Portland chapter for hosting us. I'm looking forward to talking about native plants and some of the work that my husband Drew, who many of you may also know from iNaturalist, and I have been doing over the last 20 to 23 years to cultivate and conserve the native plants of the Columbia River Gorge. I have been working with native plants in the state of Oregon since the 90s and started working with native plants in the Columbia River area around the turn of the century, which when I say it like that sounds like a really long time ago. Currently, we live on the outskirts of Mosier, just east of Hood River in the eastern Columbia River Gorge, where we run a native plant nursery called Humble Roots. Both Drew and I are very passionate about native plants and have worked on a variety of native plant projects in the area, many of which I thought would interest Native Plant Society members. So I will be sharing some of the highlights of our work over the last 20-some years with you tonight. And I'm just going to mute my video here for a second so that you can focus on all of the pretty pictures I am about to show you. Oops. All right, so here in the Columbia River Gorge, we have an incredible variation in climate, influenced by geographical features such as the Cascade Mountain Range, which bisects the gorge, causing the difference in rainfall to vary greatly between the west and east sides of the gorge, the western gorge being much wetter than the eastern gorge, as we all well know. This, along with variable elevations and aspects of north and south-facing slopes, has created a huge amount of habitat diversity, which in turn leads to a high amount of species diversity. Conserving, cultivating, and ethically propagating the diverse flora of this place, and working to encourage people to love and respect the species that make this place both beautiful and unique, has been both a joy and a struggle for us, with wins and losses around every turn. So one of the biggest highlights in our work of late has been the publication of our book, The Pacific Northwest Native Plant Primer, which was released last year. We were very honored to be invited by our favorite publisher, Timber Press, to write the Pacific Northwest version of their Native Plant Primer series. And we feel that this book provides important and useful information for both beginning and seasoned native plant lovers and gardeners living on either side of the Cascades. In fact, we do often use it as a reference ourselves. For both Drew and I, a connection to native plants started at a young age, and I personally feel this is true for everyone, whether you realize it or not. One of the things that we talk about in our book and have been speaking about a lot in the last few years is how gardening with native plants is not only important for what we call adult reasons, and these are reasons such as species loss and extinction, habitat loss, pollinator decline, climate change, water and resource conservation, eliminating point sources for non-native invasive plants escaping into the wild, and so on. On many of those adult issues, we believe that gardeners are on the forefront of sowing hope by planting native plants. And it is important to keep all of those adult reasons in mind. But what we've also been telling people is to remember that gardening with native plants can make you feel like a kid again and foster joy. I believe that the more you cultivate and nurture a thriving ecosystem in your backyard, using native plants as the backbone of your endeavor, the more your childlike curiosity grows as you see and learn about the species your landscape supports. Gardening with native plants creates a living ecosystem in our yards in which we can observe and explore, expanding our understanding of the world around us, such as we do when we are young. Because native plants foster and support local biodiversity in ways that exotic plants cannot, they make a garden or landscape more than just a sterile assortment of color and structure, but a living ecosystem and dynamic classroom that is beautiful from an ecological aesthetic. So this is what Drew and I call the beauty in biodiversity. And this is essentially a message that you've hopefully heard a lot about in recent years, perhaps from different perspectives. I'm sure you've all been exposed to the wise words of Doug Tallamy. Doug Tallamy and his colleagues have published many studies proving that native plants are essential to supporting local insects, pollinators, birds, and other wildlife. And they've shown us the breakdown that can happen to local food webs when we remove native vegetation and replace it with exotic species. These studies are giving us the proven statistics we need to encourage everyone to get on board with planting native plants and restoring local ecology in their own yards. These researchers found that in landscapes with less than 70% native plant biomass, birds like the Carolina chickadee were unable to find enough food to successfully rear enough young to sustain their populations. Many birds, even ones we don't think of as insect eaters, such as hummingbirds, eat insects and need them to rear their young. And some of the stats I've seen are that 80% of all birds eat insects in some way. 96 to 97% of terrestrial birds need insects to rear their young, and that caterpillars alone can make up as much as 87% of a chick's diet. Other studies by Doug Tallamy and his colleagues found that native woody plants support 35 times more caterpillar biomass than non-native woody plants. This is because most herbivorous insects, like butterfly and moth caterpillars, are adapted to only eat plants with which they share an evolutionary history. A well-known example of this, of course, is the monarch butterfly, which has evolved to only eat species of milkweed in its larval phase. The word about all of this is getting out, and I personally hope that this message gains momentum and turns into a tidal wave of understanding sweeping through the gardening and landscaping community. So many of our native plants have specific relationships with native insects, including pollinators such as butterflies, moths, and bees. There are many native bees that specialize on certain plants and butterflies with specific host plants. So this is a photo of a Mormon metalmark butterfly nectaring on a species of late flowering buckwheat called strict buckwheat, Eriogonum strictum, which is very similar to another species called snow buckwheat, Eriogonum niveum, in the Eastern Gorge. This butterfly, which is critically endangered in British Columbia, utilizes various species of Eriogonums as larval host plants and can be strongly associated with particular species of Eriogonums in the Columbia River area. It is special relationships like this that truly underscore the superior and unique ability of native plants to support local biodiversity. So over 20 years ago, we purchased our off-grid property and moved to where we live now in the Eastern Columbia River Gorge. When we first moved in, there was a lot of trash strewn across the land, which we have removed, and a lot of non-native invasive grasses and plants around the house. I don't actually have a lot of photos from that time, but I have a few that show some of the areas around the house and the lack of diversity that was happening due to invasive plants and human disturbance. The main invader was Poa bulbosa, or bulbous bluegrass, so named because its inflorescences create viviparous bulbils, which are essentially little sprouted bulbs that fall off and become new plants. This Eurasian grass comes up when the rains begin in the fall, and it continues to dominate local resources that other plants need, like soil moisture and nutrients. Then grows thickly, falls over, creating a suppressive thatch. Unlike some of our other non-native invasive grasses, which are annuals, the poa is perennial, so simply cutting the quote-unquote seed heads before ripening is not really going to impact the plant's vitality and longevity like it would an annual grass like cheatgrass. The infestation was, and in some cases still is, dense in places around our house, but we eradicated it in areas where we built gardens and started hand pulling it in the small meadows around the house. And here in the photos is a photo of a pile of it in our fire pit where we let it dry out before burning or thoroughly composting it. A friend of ours calls that Mount Poa. We're also working on perfecting some techniques employed in the fall that suppress the Poa, but not native plants that are dormant, by depriving the invasive grass of sunlight and rain. So as we started to remove the Poa, what we have seen happening over time with our efforts has been amazing. Just by simply removing the invasive grasses and other non-native species, we got lupins, lomatiums, buttercups, phlox, glacier lily, checker lily, and native peas like lathyrus and native vetches, and many other locally appropriate native plants to thrive. All without planting them and without watering them, I like to point out. These photos are from areas right around the house. What a few slides back was just patchy ground with invasive grasses and Shasta daisies is now thick with native forbs. Some of these plants were present then, but by removing non-native invasive plants like the Poa bulbosa, they have truly thrived and spread. And this experience has emphasized to us how the soil bank may be holding native plants and seeds laying dormant, waiting for a chance to grow, and that by removing non-native invasive species, we can create space for those native plants to flourish and regain ground. We also, like I said, removed non-native invasive grasses and plants in areas where we created native plant gardens. And now we have gardens teeming with native plants around the house. A major milestone for us was when 10 years in, the balsam root seedlings that we planted finally reached maturity and started blooming and spreading on their own. They can take a while to mature, and we always tell people that planting balsam root is a lot like planting a tree and something that you can do for future generations since they live a long time. Now I look around and see that in places where there were biodiversity dead zones, there are now biodiversity hot zones. And we know and can see that we've created an oasis, not only for native plants, but also for local insects and wildlife. Seeing and learning about the other creatures that live in and rely on our gardens is what we have found to be one of the most beautiful aspects of gardening with native plants. I always say that gardening with native plants is a gateway to falling in love with insects, because gardening with native plants has given me an easily accessible window into the insect world, and it is beyond fascinating. My garden isn't just a pretty bunch of flowers and bushes. It is a living, breathing ecosystem that is feeding and supporting probably hundreds of species of insects and wildlife. This beauty and biodiversity has changed the way I see all gardens. I can still recognize the structural beauty of any garden, but one that is devoid of biodiversity to me is not truly beautiful. And it is this way of seeing the true beauty of a garden as including the ways it can support local biodiversity and life other than our own that I think is the tidal wave of understanding that is beginning to finally gain ground. Just this month, actually, we were featured in and asked to contribute to the November-December issue of Fine Gardening magazine in an article about native keystone plants and their benefit to local biodiversity. So this is a national mainstream gardening magazine that has not only embraced the important subject of planting native keystone plants, but is featuring a lot of the wisdom that Doug Tallamy and others are advocating for. So this to me is a sign that we're nearing 100th monkey status and the critical mass of gardeners that we need to finally make native plant gardening mainstream and way cool. Here are a few more glimpses of a small amount of the diversity of life that thrives in our garden and nursery. Right now, you're looking at greenleaf manzanita, Arctostaphylos patula, in our garden. It blooms very early in the year, and when it does, it attracts tons of butterflies and native pollinators. And I love seeing the relationship that this plant has with early season pollinators. You can also see by the leaf cutouts in the upper right-hand corner that it's used by leafcutter bees. And the following are photos that I show people to illustrate the beauty of the creatures that our garden helps to sustain and support. I also suggest watching the presentation that Amy Campion did for the MPSO Portland chapter about a year ago, titled Northwest Native Garden Plants and the Amazing Insects They Attract, which you can watch on the YouTube channel. She does a great job in her presentation and on her Instagram of talking about her conversion to native plant gardening and the fascinating life her garden now attracts and supports. Here's a photo of a swallowtail butterfly larva on the gorge endemic Suxdorf's Lomatium suxdorfii, in our garden. Like other lomatiums, it's a larval host plant for certain species of swallowtail butterflies, and we have swallowtail butterfly caterpillars in our garden every year. And in the upper right-hand corner is a lichen mimic moth called an Ilia underwing that was feeding on the Oregon white oak trees around our nursery. The cedar waxwings always know when the golden currant berries are ripe in our garden, and the mason bees love the balsam root. This is Bombus nevadensis, one of our largest bumblebees, absolutely dwarfing golden currant, Ribes aureum flowers. And we love watching hummingbirds collecting cattail fluff for nesting material in the spring. It makes me happy that my garden and the natural areas around my garden can support all of these species in some way. And there are probably hundreds of creatures that have a relationship with the native plants in our garden and frequent our garden and nursery that I don't have a picture of. We do have non-native plants in our garden that support many native pollinators, and by no means do we think we all have to be purists. But we do want to shoot for that 70% mark of native plant biomass in our gardens and landscaping, and strive to reduce the introduction of potentially invasive species of plants into the landscape. Because we know that native plants support higher levels of local biodiversity than exotic plants, they provide vital food sources for native insects and wildlife, and form the backbone of healthy, functional habitat. So this is one of the main messages we've been spreading lately, because we believe that together we can all expand the collective community opinion of what we think of as beautiful in our gardens and landscaping to include native plants and the biodiversity they support, and that each and every backyard and front yard is a vital piece of the puzzle in reknitting fragmented habitat and stemming the tide of species extinction. If you want to see the expanded version of the presentation we've been giving to various groups on the subject, the Gorge has a terrific sense of place lecture series put on by the Mount Adams Institute. And in December of 2023, I spoke about the importance of cultivating biodiversity with native plants. It was recorded, and you can watch it on the Mount Adams Institute's YouTube channel. I also have a link to that presentation, which was called Mountaintop to Backyard: The Beauty of the Gorge's Native Plants, on our website, humblerootsnursery.com. That presentation goes into a lot more detail on the subject and specific native plants of the Gorge. Tonight, however, I'm not going to give that presentation because I think this group will be interested to hear about some of the projects we've worked on with native plants in the Gorge over the last few decades. So we're going to go ahead and touch on those. So to be totally honest, I was a little hesitant to start a native plant nursery, only because I had worked in enough of them to know it would become a 24/7 job, and that has proven to be very true. Our days off are few, but the work that we have done has really filled our souls, and ours is truly a labor of love. Over the years, Drew and I have worked with countless individuals, homeowners, schools, farmers, orchardists, tribes, nonprofits, businesses, community groups, government agencies, landscapers, and more, to ethically source and plant Pacific Northwest native plants. We've helped with rainwater gardens, school learning gardens, low water landscapes, pollinator gardens, food forests, backyard habitat program plantings, rare plant conservation, and innumerable restoration and conservation plantings. I absolutely love it when someone posts a picture of a native plant from us in their garden that is dripping with butterflies, or a lomatium that they planted, which is already a host to a swallowtail caterpillar. I love getting emails or online comments from people who've planted our plants and quickly started seeing more native pollinators and beneficial insects. And I am an endless reservoir for all the positive feedback we get about our book and how it has helped people understand and plant native plants. Of all the various native plant garden and landscaping projects we've helped with, one of our favorites has been the efforts of our friend Sheila Ford Richmond in the Willow Ponds neighborhood in Hood River to convert an empty lot that was once full of invasive blackberries in the middle of her neighborhood into a sanctuary for wildlife by planting native plants. So after the blackberry removal, we broke ground in 2015 with a group of volunteers from the community, and what looked like this now looks like this. It's a beautiful community planting of native plants that benefits not only the human neighbors, but also the local community of pollinators and wildlife. Big kudos go to Sheila, who has worked hard to provide for the weeding and maintenance needs that do arise each year. That community planting, along with Sheila's home gardens, which Drew has been an important part of, were featured by Jennifer Jewell, who is the host of the excellent podcast Cultivating Place, and Caitlin Atkinson in their beautiful book, Under Western Skies, which was published by Timber Press a few years ago. So keep your eyes out for that beautiful book. At our nursery, we ethically propagate our plants from seed or cuttings that we hand collect. We do not advocate for the digging of native plants from the wild unless it is a salvage operation. In fact, we encourage everyone to make sure that the nurseries where they buy their native plants from are not digging plants from the wild. Wild digging by other nurseries was happening a lot when we started our nursery, and we've made it a mission of ours to advocate for the ethical propagation of plants. It took us about 3 years when we first started to propagate enough stock to call ourselves a nursery, and we grew vegetables for local restaurants and markets to help get us going. But it was worth the wait and important that we did things thoughtfully. Sadly, many years ago, Russ Jolly told me about a disjunct population of Dodecathion, which is now Primula hendersonii at the Broughton Mill site, historically documented by Wilhelm Suxdorf, that was eradicated by unscrupulous collecting and digging by a nearby nursery. We also know of rare populations of plants that have been nearly eradicated by wildcrafting herbalists, and are hearing increasing reports about overharvested populations of medicinal native plants near Portland. With native plant populations in decline and facing increasing habitat loss due to human development and the spread of invasive species, we need to give native plants a break and propagate and cultivate them in ways that does not harm parent populations. So please don't dig native plants from the wild. I would also like to put it out there that I would like to encourage the Portland chapter and any MPSO chapter to do more outreach with local herbalists and wildcrafters to foster ethical and sustainable harvesting practices, including learning how to grow native plant medicine in their own yards, and focusing any wild harvest on edible and medicinal non-native invasive species of plants, such as St. John's wort, mullein, dandelion, salsify, mulberry, and more, many of which were brought here as food and medicine. In recent years, we've been trying to link herbalists with weed managers, and we think that this kind of partnership has a lot of potential. So like I mentioned before, we ethically propagate native plant starts for both our container nursery and for contracted grow outs, and talk about some of those projects now. So one of our first big projects as a nursery was to grow plants that support the Oregon swallowtail butterfly for a planting at a local orchard in the Dalles in celebration of Oregon's 150th birthday in 2009. There was funding at that time for enhancement projects aimed at the state's official plants and animals, the Oregon swallowtail being the state butterfly. Interesting thing about the Oregon swallowtail is that it is restricted to our native tarragon, Artemisia dracunculus, as its only larval host plant, making it a host plant specialist. Some studies have shown that the caterpillars will also eat French culinary tarragon or Russian tarragon, but that the female butterflies will only lay eggs on our wild variety. Artemisia dracunculus grows east of the Cascades, along the Columbia River and its tributaries, as well as in sagebrush country and ponderosa pine forests. Unfortunately, this plant has been mistaken as a weed and removed by gardeners and ranchers, and the Oregon swallowtail has consequently disappeared from some areas because of that. So we grew out a bunch of this plant, and the orchard planted it, which was great. Sadly, some of the folks that we did the orchard planting in subsequent years mistook the wild tarragon for weed, and some of what we planted was inadvertently pulled, but some made it. Planting wild tarragon wasn't the only goal of the project, though. Part of the orchard planting was also to plant native plants that would provide nectar for adult butterflies and pollinators, which did well, and overall the planting was a success. One of the most interesting things to come from this, from creating this insectary on this orchard, was that by attracting more native bees and creating native pollinator habitat, the orchardist saw a big increase in fruit set on particular varieties of cherry trees that honeybees were not effectively pollinating, in part because they flowered earlier during more inclement weather. The native pollinators were able to handle the more inclement weather and effectively pollinate the earlier flowering trees, which, if I remember correctly, were also a more valuable variety at market. This project and project site was also used to host many workshops with local growers and beneficial insect experts from the Xerces Society and Oregon State University, which were terrific and really helped fuel conversations about integrated pest management and native pollinator conservation with many of the farmers, vintners, and orchardists in the gorge. Since then, we've supplied many plants to and done on-site seed collection for many Columbia Gorge farms, wineries, and orchards looking to create native pollinator habitat. Another project that we got involved with early on, and that we often say is what really fuels our hearts and fills our souls, has been rare plant conservation and propagation. In particular, our efforts in this department have been focused on another species of Artemisia, Artemisia campestris variation worm sculdii, which we call arcawoe, but is also known by the common name northern wormwood. This plant is rare because the places where it grew were inundated when the dams in the Columbia were built. And just so you're aware, and to save you the question, because this is a very rare plant and a recording of this presentation will be posted to YouTube, I am not going to name the specific places where this plant grows or where we have outplanted it. We have spent many years now monitoring the one naturally occurring population in the Columbia River Gorge, which is one of only two existing natural populations along the Columbia River. We have also spent many years propagating and outplanting it with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, monitoring those plantings and looking for new outplanting sites. The latter part has been difficult because not many land managers want to plant a potentially federally endangered plant on their land. The species was a candidate for listing as endangered, which actually did not happen, but the fear of listing has kept some land managers disinterested in planting it on their properties, because if it gets listed, that would impact what they could do in the areas where it is planted. We have, however, found allies in the local tribes, such as the Yakama Nation, as well as the Columbia Land Trust, who have welcomed us planting it on their properties. There have been some fun parts and not so fun parts of working with this species. The fun part is we often have to get to our sites by boat, which is a totally fun way to get to your planting site, despite the extra coordination and weather hassles it can entail. The not so fun part is that the species likes to grow in sandy cobble, which means that a breaking bar becomes the digging tool of choice. And this is why we call the volunteers who've helped us plant this plant rock stars. We've had some other roses and thorns over the years with the fight to save the species. One of the best roses for us was doing an outplanting with Mosier school students. These young people were incredibly enthusiastic and truly cared about what happened to the plants they were planting. The planting we did with them has also been fairly successful. A very serious thorn, however, has been the shifting conditions in the places where this species grows and where we have outplanted it. We've lost many outplantings to scouring and sand inundation. As you can see here in the upper right-hand corner, I am literally digging out a plant to be able to monitor it. Most horribly, a monitoring trip we took to the closest naturally occurring population this fall revealed that we may have lost that population largely due to shifting site conditions, as well as invasive species encroachment. We've been watching this population decline over the last few decades. So we have made sure that seed of this species is stored at the Miller Seed Vault. And I'm pretty heartbroken to say that right now it's looking like that seed and the plants we have been contracted to propagate and collect seed from may be the only thing left of our closest naturally occurring population, which was and is genetically unique. The other naturally occurring population is also tanking, so the future is not altogether bright for this species, although we will keep fighting to save it and are thankful that some of our outplantings are doing very well. It feels like an increasingly uphill battle these days because climate change and invasive species are changing the landscape rapidly, making it more and more difficult to successfully get plants established, especially in drier areas. But we try to keep our heads up and keep working. The Columbia River Gorge is home to a number of plants that occur nowhere else in the world other than in and near the gorge. These species, of course, are endemic, meaning they naturally occur only in a particular limited range and nowhere else. Because of their restricted populations, these plants can be more vulnerable to habitat loss and extinction. Many of the special endemic plants found in the gorge have common names that are familiar to people who live here, and they include, going clockwise from the upper left-hand corner photo, Barrett's penstemon, Dow's Mountain buttercup, Suxdorf's lomatium, Columbia cynthris, Columbia desert parsley, and Hood River milkvetch. We have had the pleasure to propagate a few of our gorge endemic plants and cultivate them in our gardens, as well as protect naturally occurring populations of them on our property. Lomatium columbianum, Barrett's penstemon, Hydrophyllum capitatum, variation thomsonii, and Lomatium suxdorfii have been a few of our favorites to work with. In 2018, a paper was published showing that the Lomatium grayi in our area was not Lomatium grayi, but instead two newly named species, Lomatium clicquetatens and Lomatium papilionifera. At the time, it wasn't known just how extensively Lomatium clicquetatens occurred and how numerous its populations were, and it was thought that perhaps it was rare and possibly threatened species. Studies and surveys since have shown it to be an endemic plant that is abundant where it occurs, although it does have a very limited range in Oregon. In 2021, we worked with the National Scenic Area U.S. Forest Service to collect seeds of Lomatium clicquetatens and another endemic Lomatium, Lomatium suxdorfii, from the Klickitat Wildlife Refuge for the Miller Seed Vault at the University of Washington Botanic Gardens. The seeds we collected were not only sent to the seed vault, some were also used to propagate plants for outplantings. The Lomatium clicquetatens seed went to the Clark College Native Plant Center for propagation, while we sowed some of the Lomatium suxdorfii seed, producing around 1,500 plants. And just as an aside here, you're probably realizing that I take most of the photos, which means you are going to get to see a lot of pictures of Drew. Last year, the Lomatium suxdorfii plants that we grew out were planted by Forest Service staff, Friends of the Gorge, students from Lyle and Wishram, and many other volunteers from groups such as the Washington Native Plant Society, Mid-Columbia Fisheries, and Klickitat Trail Conservancy. There were a bunch of wonderful social media posts and news articles celebrating their efforts, which we absolutely love seeing. And now we look forward to seeing an increasing population of Lomatium suxdorfii along the Klickitat River, since Klickitat Mile 1 was one of the planting sites. We also hope that being involved with things like this creates a sense of stewardship and pride in the students and volunteers who worked so hard to plant these plants, and that they return to the site year after year to check on the plants and watch them grow. They may see some thrive and some perish, and even that will help educate and point their efforts in the future and their knowledge of what works at this site. Other notable projects that we've had the honor to help with include the revegetation of Northwestern Park. In 2011, the Condit Dam on the White Salmon River in Washington was removed. And if you haven't watched the video of it being blown up and the dramatic draining of water and sediment from what used to be Northwestern Lake, I highly suggest it. It's on YouTube. What was expected to take 6 hours to drain took just 30 minutes. So, like I said, it was pretty dramatic. Jeanette Burkhart, watershed planner for the Yakima Nation Fisheries, coordinated the restoration of the newly re-exposed riverbanks, and we helped by growing some plants for the project and planting them. We didn't grow all of the plants for the project, and many of the plants that we grew were part of the successional long-term revegetation of the area. According to reporting in Columbia Insight, which is a great source for environmental news in the Columbia Gorge and Pacific Northwest, 500 volunteers planted well over 7,000 native plants in a 2.8-acre area after the dam removal. Also important and notable to us have been the many projects we've worked on and provided plants for, with two incredible land trusts that are working hard to conserve and enhance land in the gorge, the Columbia Land Trust and the Friends of the Columbia Gorge Land Trust. And we've enjoyed not only working with these two conservation groups, but also volunteering with them on monitoring projects. We commend these land trusts for the work that they do, and we love working with their terrific staff. We also appreciate that they strive to use locally appropriate plant material, and because of that, many of the grow-outs that we've done for them involve on-site seed collection. So these photos are from a Columbia Land Trust project that we grew out plants for in 2017. This project was part of what is called the Powerdale Corridor. In 2010, the Powerdale Dam on the Hood River was removed, and Columbia Land Trust worked with Hood River County to conserve 400 acres of land along that corridor. Columbia Land Trust removed 2,600 feet of decaying steel pipeline from that land, leaving popular recreation trails, but also restoring and enhancing the habitat for fish and wildlife. Columbia Land Trust asked us to work with them on providing locally appropriate native plant material for the restoration work at this site. And for this project, we were able to collect seeds of targeted species already present on the property from areas where the native vegetation was intact. As we grew out the plants from those seeds, Columbia Land Trust removed some large blackberry infestations on the property and then replanted those areas in areas where the pipeline was removed with the plants that we grew out from seed collected on site. We really love doing projects like that, where we have a place to collect seed from near or on the property where the plants that we're growing out will be planted, so that we know the plant material we're providing is the most appropriate for the site. In 2014, we did something similar when the Friends of the Columbia Gorge Land Trust put in the now very popular Mosier Plateau Trail on their property. They asked us to collect seed on site for them to use to reseed in disturbed areas along the side of the newly installed trail. And they had us work with a small group of volunteers, teaching them how and what to collect, which everybody really enjoyed. We then dried and cleaned the seed and made a mix for the land trust and trail installers to use. The background photo here is a seed of Giardia aristata and Eriogonum compositum, also known as blanket flower and heartleaf buckwheat, that we had collected with the volunteers right before we started to mix it together. And as you can tell, we only did a rough cleaning on the Eriogonum, which was fine because the mix was going to be hand spread. We've since worked with the Friends of the Columbia Gorge Land Trust on many projects and have helped them to help to supply them with locally appropriate plant material for various plantings. They have a great group of locally invested individuals that we have always enjoyed working with, and they're doing really good work in the gorge to protect the amazing flora and fauna that lives here, as is the Columbia Land Trust. Again, we just love working with groups like these. We've found that more and more people are interested in learning how to collect native plant seeds. And for the last 2 years, we have worked with Columbia Land Trust and the East Cascades Oak Partnership, which operates under the umbrella of the Columbia Land Trust, to do seed collecting workshops on their properties for professionals and interested individuals. We're also currently volunteering time to meet with the East Cascades Oak Partnership Native Plant Materials Working Group to identify target species for seed increase and develop ways to produce that seed to use for projects and post-fire treatments in oak habitats. And speaking of the East Cascades Oak Partnership, I want to take a pause here to give a special shout out for the Oregon white oak and how fortunate we are to live alongside it. And this is a keystone native tree that directly or indirectly supports hundreds of species of wildlife. Oregon white oak habitats are one of the most important, but sadly one of the most critically endangered habitats in the region. And planting or protecting a native oak tree can be a very important action in the effort to stem the tide of species extinction and reknit fragmented habitat. And if you want to learn more about our local oak trees, I do encourage you to check out the work of the East Cascades Oak Partnership, which, as I mentioned earlier, operates under the umbrella of the Columbia Land Trust. And they just told us this morning at a meeting that they are launching a new website, probably early next year, that will have a lot of great resources for private landowners and others to use. So in 2019, we started working with the Hood River Watershed Group on a very interesting project. The Watershed Group is working with Farmers Irrigation District, the nonprofit government agency that supplies agricultural and residential water to the Hood River Valley. The irrigation system that supplies this water had been around for over 100 years, and it needed updating, particularly for water conservation measures. In some areas, the irrigation lines were open, exposed ditches, and they've now been piped and buried. So this created an opportunity that the Hood River Watershed Group has done a great job on and involved us with, and that is to create a pollinator corridor over the long stretch of areas where the new pipeline had been recently buried. Not only did we provide plants to this project, Drew consulted on the project in general and helped to create plant and seed lists for the project. He also was there to help place plants and has been monitoring the project with the Hood River Watershed Group since the planting. The plantings have overall been a success. Our last monitoring trip revealed one setback, however. The timber property surrounding the pipeline plantings changed ownership, and a new timber company came in. Somehow in the shuffle, they apparently sprayed some of the planting, and unfortunately, we lost many of the later season flowering plants that had been thriving in that section. Early flowering plants such as Oregon Sunshine and Eriogonum survived, however. Despite this unfortunate setback, like I said, the planting has overall been a success, and we have seen lots of native pollinators foraging in and near the new pollinator corridor. Pollination, a great podcast of the Oregon State University Extension Service, covered this project and visited it with Alex Danielson from the Hood River Watershed Group. And I highly suggest listening to this short program, which aired in September of 2022, to learn more about this subject, its vision, and its potential to lead the way for other pollinator corridor projects. We have also turned potential disaster into opportunity for pollinators on our property. In 2020, a fast-moving wildfire forced us to evacuate. We thought we had lost our house. When we returned a week later, our house was spared, but there was a newly bulldozed fire line across a quarter mile of the property from the firefighting activity. Since then, we've cleaned up that dozer line and maintained it for future firefighting access in hopes that new disturbance will not be needed. We have hand-pulled the cheatgrass that came in on the dozer tires, healed many trees, and sown seed of native grasses and perennials to create a pollinator corridor. Idaho fescue's been great for quick establishment and holding ground, and it is a bunch grass, so it leaves perfect spaces for native perennials to germinate and grow in between it. This is a xeric planting, so some plant development is slow, but we have lots of Oregon Sunshine, penstemons, lomatiums, and other perennials getting established in there and now starting to bloom. In particular, the paintbrush has done very well and grown quickly by seed. The fescue is probably helping it since paintbrush is hemiparasitic and can live on fescue. And we now have some showy patches of paintbrush happening in there. In the spring and summer, I see lots of butterflies flying and foraging in the dozer line, and it's really beautiful to see. With continued and increasing firefighting efforts in our area, perhaps more dozer lines like this across private property could become pollinator corridors, using locally appropriate native plants, of course, while also being permanent firefighting access points, thus lessening the need for new dozer lines in the future. In recent years, we've gotten involved in a big project that we're excited about and are looking forward to sharing with you tonight. And this is the effort to revitalize the historic Wind River Nursery near Carson, Washington, as a native plant nursery and regional native plant center. If you aren't familiar, the Wind River Nursery was a Forest Service nursery that was started around 1910 to produce tree seedlings for replanting after forest fires. It became quite extensive, employing much of the local community and producing 21 million seedlings annually before its closure in 1997. Recently, a portion of the historic nursery lands and buildings were conveyed from the Forest Service to Skamania County. The county is now looking to restore the economic potential of these lands for the community, and the Wind River Trust is working to revitalize the site as a native plant center and nursery. At the nursery site, there are multiple historic buildings constructed by the CCC, and the Wind River Trust has already restored the Ranger Training Center, which it now uses and rents out for events. The trust is also working to restore 2 other buildings, one of which is now a volunteer staffed visitor center, and the other which will be the center for the nursery. Also on site is an arboretum with trails and signage, which the Wind River Trust maintains, as well as tree seed lots and fallow nursery fields, some of which are still under Forest Service jurisdiction. Large established sequoias now line Chapman Avenue, where they were planted when the historic nursery was in operation. And there's also a ranger station that was established around the same time. And it's a beautiful area with the Pacific Crest Trail passing by the edge of one of the nursery fields. Adding to the interesting features at and near this site, in 1912, the Wind River Experimental Forest and Wind River Experiment Station, called the Cradle of Forestry Research in the Pacific Northwest, was established in conjunction with the nursery and abuts the historic nursery grounds. And some of you might have heard of the 250-foot tall canopy crane that was once located in the experimental forest, which was integral to the research that led to much of our understanding of the ecology of Pacific Northwest old-growth forests. So almost 2 years ago now, Jeff DeBell, Wind River Trust board member and forest geneticist with Washington DNR, called on interested community members and potential project partners to meet at the site and discuss the possibilities of revitalizing the historic nursery as a native plant nursery and native plant center. The Wind River Trust had already restored the training center and gotten the lease for the 2 other buildings I mentioned, along with 2.7 acres of Martha Creek Field, one of the historic nursery fields, which is currently being used for cattle grazing. Some of the main project partners that emerged from those early meetings with the Wind River Trust were the local community, Underwood Conservation District, the Skamania County Noxious Weed Control Program, the Gifford-Pinchot Mount Adams Ranger District, and us. Clemson University has also been bringing classes of design students to help generate and design plans for the potential native plant center. Each of these project partners has been vital to this project. And of course, none of this would be possible without the Wind River Trust and the help of the local community. There are a lot of possibilities for this project, and some of the early visions expressed by those involved include native plant and seed production, native seed increase for the Forest Service, display and educational native plant and pollinator gardens, glamping and event space, and creating a native plant center for the Pacific Northwest. Within these first few years, our group has already managed to start a volunteer-run native plant nursery currently funded by and focused on tree and shrub production for Underwood Conservation District and their projects. Our group has also fenced the leased 2.7 acres of Martha Creek Field and solarized a portion of it. There's a lot of weed pressure there, so we're trying to eliminate the weeds before sowing anything, and while we develop a plan for that portion of the field. Although there is significant weed pressure in the field, there is a great population of bicolor lupin, Lupinus bicolor, in the field, and a nice population of osaberry, Omlarius raciformis, near the field, both of which we collected seed from this summer. A few weeks ago, we had a work party to plant some of those seeds that we had collected, both in the nursery and the field. We focused on using annuals like the lupin in the field and things that we can collect seed from, but won't be too permanent as we determine the success of the solarization and develop plans for the field. Another big milestone is that we had our first annual fall native plant sale in October, which was named the Hemlock Heritage Fest. So the area where the historic nursery is used to be called Hemlock, but more recently it is referred to as Stabler, Washington, even though Stabler does not have its own zip code, so the physical address is actually Carson, Washington. But the name Hemlock was honored in the name of the festival, and many local businesses and artisans participated. A lot of plants found homes, and we're looking forward to this event becoming a successful annual event. We also look forward to seeing this project continue to develop and realize the potential of becoming a regional native plant center and a place of growing and learning about native plants. We think that the need for locally appropriate native plants and seed is significant, and we hope to see this project help to fulfill some of that need. Like I said, one of the big project partners at the Wind River Nursery is the Skamania County Noxious Weed Control Program. And if you're heading out in the gorge this spring to see the flowers blooming, I suggest stopping by the Hedgewald Center's Native Plant Display Garden in Stevenson, Washington, which is the work of the fabulous people at the Weed Control Program, in which you can find many of our plants. So if you come to visit our nursery or hike some of the East Gorge hiking trails, you will likely drive through our little community of Mosier and past Mosier's Totem Park, where we've been volunteering to plant and 10 native plants since the park was created in 2014. A few years ago, we formed a group of community volunteers called the Mosier Green Space Gardeners. This great group of volunteers not only tends to the plantings at Totem Park, but we also adopted Chamberlain Park from ODOT. Chamberlain Park is named after Keith Chamberlain, who was an important MPSO member and advocate for the native plants of the gorge. And our group is working at times with local students to create a xeric pollinator garden there and tend a beautiful population of Lomatium brevifolium that occurs naturally on site. One thing we are excited about is that over the last year, the Green Space Gardeners have revamped and replanted the Jerry Igo Memorial Native Plant Garden, which is at Totem Park. Jerry Igo was another important MPSO member and native plant advocate who lived in Mosier. Thanks to our group's efforts, the Igo Garden is really coming along, and we are looking forward to seeing it bloom next year. We installed a new dedication sign for the garden last fall, and this fall our group created and placed signage on the native plants we've planted in the park. I love seeing this become a place where people that come to Mosier to hike and see the beautiful wildflowers can learn a bit more about the plants they might see in the area. I also want to give a shout out to the group of MPSO Portland chapter members who have been stewarding what among the native plant crowd is known as the Russ Jolly Wayside. This is a pull-off along I-84 just west of Mosier, where Russ Jolly, Barbara Robinson, and others have planted and maintained some beautiful native plants. We've helped with these efforts in recent years. And speaking of Barbara Robinson, who of course is a legend in the gorge, there's a new film about her titled The Wildflower Woman that was just released this week on the Friends of the Columbia Gorge YouTube channel. It's definitely worth watching. A big part of loving our native flora is continually spreading the word to treat it with respect and minimize our impact on their populations and places where they grow. We encourage everyone who recreates in the gorge to volunteer at least once to steward it and to help encourage everyone to care for and respect the amazing plants that live here. We've watched the invasive plant populations increase along some of the East Gorge hiking trails over time, particularly when the Eagle Creek fire shut down the West Gorge, and consequently the East Gorge trails gained more popularity. So we're constantly reminding people to use boot brushes as well as brush their pets before hitting the trail. Sadly, we do get a lot of reports of people picking wildflowers, and I always hope to educate people about the impact that can have on our flowering plants. And we hope that all of you can help us to spread this message so that the native plant populations of the gorge can continue to thrive. There's a lot more that we've done, projects collaborated on, workshops and educational events taught, and even just general observations about native plant population health in the gorge that we just don't have time to include in our talk tonight. The Columbia River Gorge is an amazing place with a wide diversity of habitat. We love our work to conserve and ethically propagate the diverse flora of this area and the Pacific Northwest. We're thankful for the incredible individuals, professionals, and project partners that we've had the pleasure to work with over the many years that we've been cultivating and educating people about native plants in the Columbia Gorge. We are a small but mighty operation, being just the two of us. And while we do sometimes have our hands in the dirt with larger projects, a majority of our work will always be working with individuals, gardeners, and landscapers, and we're always open to the public by appointment. We believe that each and every one of us can be a part of growing a better future and stemming the tide of species extinction simply by planting native plants and seeking to reknit fragmented habitat in our neighborhoods and yards, while also sowing joy and rekindling that childlike wonder for the natural world. So we welcome you to visit us at the nursery so we can talk more about native plants, and invite you to follow us on social media if you want to know about new projects or upcoming events. And we thank you. And of course, we're happy to answer any questions you might have at this time.
Thank you so much, Kristin. That was so inspiring and just amazing, all of the work that you're doing. So thank you for sharing all of this. For folks in the audience, there are a few questions. I'm going to go through them as they came in. So if you have any other questions that are popping up, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll ask them for you. So the first one that I saw earlier was, do you have a recommendation for native understory plants that will fare well under Doug firs?
Yeah.
Myanthemum racemosum, fringe cup are
Fringe
some of
cup.
our favorites.
Mhm.
Notha chelone is another good.
I was going to say, by the way, I'm bringing in
Oh,
Drew
yeah.
to help answer questions.
Are we
Can
still? Oh, we're still sharing the screen.
Should I stop sharing here?
Whatever you want to do.
Okay, all right. I'll just leave it up. It's pretty.
There are some great options out there. A lot of a lot of species. A great way to get some inspiration, obviously, is, of course, walking around and seeing what does grow in the wild under those situations. One of the biggest issues that we've encountered with the folks trying to do those kind of plantings is that a lot of times the trees do need to be limbed up a little bit, at least. If it's too dense shade, a lot of stuff, just even the really shade tolerant stuff, we'll still have a hard time establishing. But yeah, there's a few things.
Yeah. Actea, I see baneberry in the understory a lot. And yeah, the fringe cup for sure.
Yeah, oh, gotta love a good fringe cup.
Mhm.
Yeah. Another Lauren asks, can you speak to what maintenance look like in your native garden, particularly speaking about pruning?
Okay. That's interesting. I was going to say, it's definitely, I think, a misconception that native plant gardens are maintenance free. But we do think that if you put the right plant in the right place, that can lessen the maintenance needs and site preparation. We talk about that in our book. The more site preparation you do, the less weeds you'll be managing over time. But we definitely have weeding to do, and you know, all the native plants, they are viable by seeds. So there are some species that have done so well that we do sort of have to keep up on getting their seed before it spreads. Lomatium dissectum is one of those plants for us. And the Lomatium columbianum, which just loves to grow in the, you know, in the Mosier area. So those are plants that at this point we actually do make sure we get all the seed and spread it in other places, because they propagate very easily in our garden now after we planted them. And as to pruning,
as far as pruning, with a lot of the natives, the shrubs in particular, it's usually just the first couple of years of shaping, kind of just getting the overall habit of the plant together. A lot of times, if a lot of the shrubs are needing excessive amounts of pruning and just super leggy, usually that's just a sign of overwatering or over-rich soil. At least over on this side of the mountains, things might be a little different for y'all over there, but usually after a few years, it's just some shaping and getting the like I said, the habit of the plant together. Most of the time, they'll just take care of themselves. And of course, this is a very general statement, and each species has its own little tricks to it, but there's general rules to pruning stuff. You know, if it flowers in the spring, if you want blooms, you know, cut it after the flowers are done blooming. If you want to prune for growth, cut it in the fall. But yeah, generally we try to just take a pretty hands-off approach, just a little bit of shaping and let it run its course.
Yeah, we do take extra care when we're pruning any elderberries, because those are the elderberries with their pithy stems are just such fabulous, provide such fabulous nesting cavities for beneficial insects. You know, some of these bees like mason bees that nest in pithy stems of plants and things like that. And so when we prune our elderberries, we always leave, you know, about 3 to 4 inches above each node, and then that becomes a habitat for these cavity nesting beneficial insects. And then with perennial plants too, we do try, if we prune them, which we do like to leave all the plant material over the winter, because you know, we see that insects are nesting or overwintering in or under them. And but if we do have some plants that we need to cut back, we try to leave at least a couple feet. With our Artemisia ludwickiana, that's one that I see a lot of beneficial insects overwintering in, and our lomatium stalks and things like that. So we try to make sure that those stay over winter, and then we can remove those older stalks the next year.
Great. This is a statement from one of our previous speakers, Mitch Cruzan, who said we might need to rethink, quote, locally appropriate plant material as climate change progresses. When available, we should consider mixing local sources with sources from more drought-tolerant populations. Somebody else replied that we should do this with great care and that there's some risk to that. I'm just curious about, I guess, like what your response is to that, or what your ethos is in your projects with that kind of thought in mind, with the way that climate's changing.
Yeah, that, you know, interestingly came up. We were in one of the East Cascade Oak Partnership plant material meeting this morning, and one of the things we're looking at is seed transfer zones, and what zones are, you know, where's seed source coming from? Where are the zones that we're comfortable with taking from? And one of the things that a lot of the folks in the meeting were saying was that if we go outside of our zone, that we should go to a hotter, drier zone. And so that seems to be the thinking, although, you know, we have these climatic events that aren't necessarily only drought. Sometimes we are getting, you know, more rain or heavier freezes, or so it's difficult. And I have mixed feelings about assisted migration, only because it seems like there's always something you are pushing out also.
And I would add to it too, you know, I'm open to moving genotypes within a species around. I'm very hesitant the whole idea of assisted migration, and I forget who made the statement, but what is really sunk in for me with assisted migration is that it's easy enough to move a tree, you can't move an ecosystem. And unfortunately, climate change is forcing evolution, or forcing these species to adapt quicker than evolution provides the ability to. So I do understand that there is a whole huge gray area between both ends of the spectrum. But ultimately, we can't create ecosystems, we can't recreate an ecosystem in a new place. Those are going to have to evolve.
Yeah, thanks for that insight.
Yeah, I would say, you know, we are seeing species moving up naturally. Ceanothus thyrsophloris, the blue blossom, is being seen further and further north. So it is happening naturally.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Dawn says, we have 5 acres outside the western part of the Dalles, and I have noticed cheatgrass on our property. How do we eradicate non-natives like this without harming our natives while also ensuring defensive fire space? We have some Fracera on our property, as well as Hooker's onions. And Jude Foster appropriately said that your book would be a great resource for this, but I'll allow you to also speak to it.
Very sweet.
Cheatgrass, I mean, it's hard for me to say that it's one of the easier ones to deal with because it is such a problem, but being an annual with seed that doesn't stay viable for an extremely long period of time compared to certainly some other weedy species, mowing, weed whacking at an appropriate time to remove the seed before it fully develops. There is a timing window there where if you do it too early, it's just going to flush out again and produce probably even more seed than it would have in the first place. And if you wait too late, then obviously seed's developed and it's going to ripen on the ground. But there is a window in there where you can knock it back, and after just a couple of years of mowing, in that sense, you can really knock it back quite a bit. It's not a huge area. Hand pulling certainly effective, but the important thing with any of the weed removal projects is, nature abhors the vacuum. So if you remove that weed, and this is something that I've experienced just around the nursery, eradicating the cereal ryegrass. That's a very aggressive annual grass species, which with a little bit of mowing, that one's a lot easier with the timing. I think 2 seasons pretty much in knocking back the seed heads, fully eradicate it from the area for the most part. However, since I was just kind of for fire, I was mostly knocking it down for that reason. Without reseeding those areas, now we've got a beautiful crop of knapweed, bindweed, some of the really perennial issues. So filling that vacuum after you've removed that cheatgrass is really important, and that's where the like Idaho fescue is going to be really important, certainly around the Dalles, June grass as well. We've actually worked on one project, a neighbor over the ridge here. He actually seeded the cereal ryegrass in with his June grass and fescue, knowing that it would establish quick, provide the erosion control he needed. And as the June grass and fescue take a little longer to establish, he was able to use the annual ryegrass to hold the soil, and then before it set seed, mow it back, and that was enough for that single year to control the erosion and buy some time for the fescue and June grass to move in. So again, like all these kind of questions, everything's been kind of relative to the species, but the really big thing there is just nature abhors the vacuum. So no matter what you do to remove your weeds, you do need to fill that space with something you want there to hold the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That's a great thing. I feel like a lot of restoration efforts are seeing that, like, they remove one thing and then something worse just comes in if they don't work with it the proper way. So that definitely makes sense.
There are several
Yeah.
different methods of weed management. We talk about a few of them in the book. Some projects with weeding situated, like I'd almost rather walk into an old pasture where it's all weeds. It makes life so much easier because then you can start looking at solarization, more intensive management issues. Some of the hardest projects are always going to be those ones where you do have those like nice little patches of native plants within the population and the weeds you're trying to deal with. And it's regardless of however you go about it, it is a difficult process, and it is something that's never going to end.
Yeah.
We've got a patch of diffuse knapweed along our driveway that we've been pulling for over 20 years now, and that seed's still viable in the soil, and it's still coming up. So it's a battle that's pretty much never going to end. So we just got to be diligent and fill that space with what we want there.
Yeah. We have gotten on some early eruptions of yellow star thistle in the Mosier area, though, and because we caught them quickly and we worked on them diligently for as many years as it took before they were gone, we kept the Mosier hillsides from becoming yellow star thistle. But then once that plant takes off, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Next question comes from Jane. They say, I have been looking for odd pieces of land, small, unbuildable, etc., to plant on native trees. These are often steep or cliffs. Do you have recommendations for planting on like very steep land? I know you talked a little bit about erosion control with the fire stuff, but that kind of a steepness is a challenge.
It's going to be a pretty site-specific question. It's Yeah, that's
I think we'd
there's a
have to
lot
take a
of
look at it.
yeah, there's a lot of a lot of variables in that question that I'm gonna have a hard time
Yeah.
coming up with a suitable answer for. But yeah, we've done some that were, road cuts that were fully denuded. We've tried different methods of laying out burlap and seeding into that and that sort of stuff, which we've had mixed results with. The biggest issue with working on a hillside is the disturbance that you're going to cause walking up and down it. And it's going to kind of come down to just the nature of the grade and the species that you're trying to deal with. If it's a planting situation, digging your holes is going to cause a disturbance, which is going to create an avenue for erosion to start creating. So it's a tricky situation for sure. Hopefully, a lot of times those steeper grades and certainly the rocky spots out here, those areas tend to keep a lot of the cows off, and you can't plow it. And so a lot of times those areas are actually some of the most intact areas that we have. So there's a little bit of hope there.
Yeah. If it's wet enough, cuttings, stakes are less movement of the soil, but sounds, with a steep area, it's probably sharp drainage, so that might not work as well.
Wonderful. B gave lots of wonderful compliments to y'all, and there's lots of everybody says that this was such a wonderful presentation. I encourage you to read through the comments, but B was asking, is there any way to help spread the word of planting native plants instead of whichever seeds you might find at the store? Lots of folks gave a lot of different things about the backyard habitat program and talking to nurseries and vendors. But yeah, if there's anything that you can kind of add about how to spread the word.
I mean,
Age-old question, hey?
yeah, there's so many ways to do that. I mean, one of the biggest drivers, of course, being in a capitalist society is going to be the consumer demand, and going into your nurseries and asking them for those products. And when they say they don't have them, trying to encourage them to find access to those. It's really, it's a big shift from what the conventional nursery trade is used to. But it's like all the word of mouth is super essential. The big issue with a lot of folks getting turned on to natives is just the idea that they're all weeds and that like you can't, if you're just gonna let your lawn go sort of thing. And so trying to convince people and showing them the beauty of the native plants and how they can be incorporated into a landscape is also huge.
Yeah. They also asked, are there any recommendations on how to go about growing a native ecosystem on like a balcony or something similar, like or
Um,
container?
There are a lot of native plants that do great in containers. That park in Mosier, the Totem Park, we've got a handful of planters out there, and we've been kind of playing with what does well on those over the last 10 years or so, however long it's been. So there are options for that. We've done some green roof plantings and stuff, which I have mixed feelings about, certainly on the side of the mountains. But yeah, there are ways of doing that. And even just, yeah, that one plant in the pot on the porch, if that's what you have to work with, I mean, that does make a difference. You will see pollinators coming there. Obviously, it's not going to be as monumental as, a 10-acre restoration project sort of situation. But yeah, where there's a spot for a plant, that very well could be a native plant.
Okay. Next question I see is from Caroline. Any tips on removing oxeye daisy in areas that also have natives?
Hand pulling.
Mm,
It's not too hard to pull, but yeah, if you're looking at like a infestation like is in that Martha Creek field, I mean that's a lot of pulling. That's maybe more solarization, I guess. But you said it's in between other native plants. In between native plants. Is that the case?
yeah, that's what it sounds like, but I don't know.
Yeah.
The bare minimum, if you're able to just, cut a lot of flowers for your bouquets just to reduce the seed production. That's like
Yeah.
the minimum, just trying to make sure that next generation isn't developing, would be my first course of action at the minimum. But yeah, that's like I was saying before, those projects where it's a mix of non-native and natives, those are the most difficult compared to a full-on old pasture or just, pulling a certain weed or species within a relatively intact native species. It's work. We don't advocate the use of chemicals, but there are those projects of scale that herbicides are needed. And like I said, it's nothing I'm advocating, but that is a tool that's out there that some people choose to use in like a spot spraying kind of situation. But if it's not a huge problem or a huge population, if you're able to hand pull it, that's always going to be the most effective way for most plants. And of course, there's always that little piece of root that turns into a new plant. And just again, when it comes to weeds, it's never going to end until you get something in there that you want.
Yeah. I think I just have two more questions. Jude asked, and I think this is something that is what also crossed my mind. Tell us how you manage all of these projects and still maintain Humble Roots Nursery. How do you do all of these things?
I don't know.
I just saw that comment and I was like, yeah, we have no answer to that.
We don't really have a life, I guess, other than our native
Yeah,
plants. I mean, this is the time of year we're sowing seed, and I'm out there with a headlamp. We've been out there with headlamps on until 9, 10 o'clock at night trying to get the seed sown before the snow comes. And so it's just, it's what we love, so it's what we do.
Although we have been going to bed a little bit earlier. I mean, we do kind of tend to eat dinner at like 11 o'clock. It's ridiculous. It gets ridiculous in the summer, but now we're going to bed a little early, and I realize I'm only wired for about 6 hours of sleep. So I'm like, boom, 3:30 in the morning, awake, ready to go. But yeah, it's a labor of love. We really we get a lot back for all that we give to, and I think that's the way that things work like that. The more you give, the more you get, and we just love it, and we just can't say no. It's just a lot of cool things going on, and we want to be a part of it.
Yeah, you're definitely part of a lot of really cool things. And then the last question I have is from Elaine. They ask, what are the greatest threats you see in the gorge exotic species wise? I noticed tons of bachelor's buttons and exotic grasses. What else are you worried about? One person also mentioned cereal rye, and then just Paul Slichter just put in the rush skeleton weed as well. But
that would have been my first
rush
at the moment.
weed.
Yeah, it's just so tenacious. It travels so far as seed. That is one that every little piece of root turns into a new plant. So that is a lot of the larger land managers are having to rely on herbicide treatments for that. Even the Rush Jolly Way side, where we've been working on it for pretty diligently for the last couple of years, we are definitely knocking it back. But you can see those areas that we're really careful getting as much of out of there we can, and there's all those little sprouts just from those little pieces of root that are left. So that one's pretty high on my list.
Yeah, the invasive grasses too, and we're seeing them increase after fires, which is really scary.
Yeah.
Out in the Deschutes, there was just beautiful bunch grass habitat out there, and population of bunch grasses, and fire came through, and after that it was just invasive grasses.
Yeah, that was all the cereal rye on that one.
Yeah. And studies are coming out about how after these fires, these invasive grasses are taking over, and they're hindering the regeneration of the forests and the native plant populations. And we're seeing that firsthand.
At the same time, increasing the susceptibility to fire too. So
yeah,
kind of a
really lose there.
Yeah.
Yeah, invasive species are a really big deal.
One that
common hound's tongue is another one that's cropping up a lot in Mosier. We didn't have it here; it was more on the Washington side, and now we're getting reports of just whole oak understories of just this common hound's tongue, which we have a native hound's tongue also. Just so everybody knows, I try to do a lot of education with folks around here, making sure they're not just like hound's tongue, pull it, and then they're pulling the wrong one, because the native is just a precious, beautiful plant. And then yellow star thistle is popping up in places, and that's pretty bad. And then there's some aquatic, some rushes and things like that I'm not that well aware of, but that are not only encroaching along the river, but they're encouraging invasive species of fish. Also, these aquatic, I think flowering rush is one of them. Anyway. Things that are on the radar.
So yeah, there's Plenty of threats, to say the least.
Yeah, so many.
Yeah.
Yeah, Willow just added that we've had success keeping the skeleton weed at bay at Russ Jolly by pulling it every 4 months, especially in July before the flowers go to seed. Stop by milepost 68 westbound I-84 to see our Adopt a Highway of 5 acres we've tended for the last 36 years. So very
Mhm.
exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's all of the questions I have.